Welcome to this episode of Studio Tips, and we want to welcome everybody here. And on this subject of changes in binding media and the search for the lost secrets of the masters. But before we begin with this presentation, I just want to have a couple of house cleaning announcements. One is that we regularly have the Studio Tips usually in the last week of the month, but next month we're not going to have Studio Tips, and that's because I'm getting very busy with a number of projects, one of course which is lead white. And speaking about lead white, I'm going to be talking and kind of an informal chat tomorrow, and this will be available on YouTube as well as Facebook. And I'm going to be discussing the situation with lead white. The title of this little discussion is, Will Lead White Soon Become Unavailable? And there's some good news and there's some bad news in all of this. But overall, we're going to be talking about lead white. I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of lead white so that you have a better perspective, both ancient history and a little bit modern history, so you know where lead white is going. And we'll also talk about why lead white is so important for oil painters. And of course, this realization has been long held, but through science has become even more important today. And that will be, of course, tomorrow, September 30th at 10 a.m. Pacific time. So it's the same time, just tomorrow morning. And you can watch that on the YouTube and Facebook, Natural Pigments Facebook channel and the Rublev Colors YouTube channel. Now today I'm going to have a presentation. This is a video recorded presentation on changes in binding media. And this is really about artist materials and artist materials from a historical perspective and how the binding media in oil painting changed over the centuries. And this change was due to a number of factors, and we'll outline some of those factors, one of them which of course is industrialization, and another one perhaps even more importantly, which we'll talk about, is the change in the status of visual artists or painters, as well as sculptors. Now, really through this whole period, which we'll discuss, is how the separation between theory and practice of painting then caused the search for the supposed lost secrets of the old masters. And that's what we're going to be focusing on. So I hope you enjoy this, and we'll start without further ado. Dramatic changes in the techniques and materials used by artists began to occur in the latter half of the 18th century as artists gave the binding media much more attention than in previous centuries. What brought about the change in binding media? How did this lead to the search for the secrets of the old masters? Join me on a journey of art history from the 17th century to the present. The separation of artists from their craft became widespread in the 19th century, but it was a trend that had begun much earlier. By the early 17th century, the dominance of architects over masons and carpenters in buildings was established, and about the same time, the status of painters began to rise. This separation may have been encouraged by, or perhaps even inspired, the industrialization of artist materials, but it also had far-reaching effects in the materials and practice of painting. Artists began using materials capriciously. Construction became less important than effect. Whereas the whimsical use of materials may have always existed among painters, it was always guided by the traditions of the workshop. For the first time, artists yielded a power that was formerly the domain of the evolutionary process of craftsmanship. The establishment of academies evoked changes in the education of young painters that aided the rise in the status of artists. One of the earliest academies for painting and sculpture was the Accademia di San Luca, founded as an association of artists in Rome. Earlier academies, such as the Compagnia di San Luca, were really guilds of painters. Differing markedly from that of its predecessor, the purpose of this academy was to elevate the work of artists, which included painters, sculptors, and architects, above that of mere craftsmen. The Accademia di San Luca later served as the model for the Académie Royale of Painting and Sculpture founded in France in 1648, to distinguish artists who were gentlemen practicing the liberal art from craftsmen who were engaged in manual labor. You should clearly understand one fact. To begin with, the Paris Academy was never meant to deal with the whole of the professional education of a young painter or sculptor. He neither painted nor carved nor modeled figures or reliefs during his working hours at the academy. All this he had to learn in the workshop of his master, with whom he still lived and under whom he still worked in a way almost identical with that of the Middle Ages. However, as the emphasis in the education of young artists changed from one of a traditional craft in workshops to one of the liberal arts taught at academies, the status of artist was simultaneously elevated. Whether or not this change in status had an effect outside the sphere of artists, a growing number of individuals began practicing the art of painting for pleasure, creating a new class of painters, amateur artists. This new class of painters created a distinction from artists trained in the workshops who were expected to adhere to a certain minimum quality standard. There was no expectation of training or quality for amateurs who perhaps attended academies but did not work in artist workshops. The industrialization that began first in England about the middle of the 18th century changed how painters worked by freeing them from the drudgery of making paint, but it also released them from the discipline of their craft. The commercial production and packaging of paints is central to the history of art in the 19th century. British colormen were at the forefront of developments from the color clothlets of the medieval limner to the appearance of bladder colors in the 17th century to the watercolor cakes of the Reeves brothers and the introduction of collapsible metal tubes for oil paints. These innovations were undoubtedly in response to the demand created by professional painters, distancing themselves from the manual labor of the craft. Still another source was the new demand from the growing ranks of amateur painters. It is this demand that likely developed shops specializing in artist materials in the 17th century. That amateurs were a new and growing segment of artists in the 17th century is evident from the number of painting manuals written by amateur artists in the second half of the century. In his Italian notebook, Richard Simmons, a 17th century amateur painter, describes how shops, or botteghe, sold brushes, canvases, and colors in bladders. Workshop apprentices still produce many of these materials because professional artists seldom relied on unscrupulous colormen who often used cheap substitutes to adulterate expensive materials. That colormen were not always to be trusted is evident from William Williams' account in his essay on the mechanic of oil colors. He wrote, "The use of a bad oil procured from a color shop. The pictures never dried, but ran down in tears. Whether from the folly of the artist or the knavery of the colorman, history says not." The system of education in the medieval workshop that gave individuals the basic skills of painting was in decline due to industrialization. Innovations like packaged colors in the form of watercolor cakes and tubed oil paint furthered the painter's position by detaching him from the manual labor needed to produce them. Although industrial development created new opportunities for painters, such as plein air painting, it ultimately removed artists from the first-hand experience gained by making these commodities. The artist's understanding of his materials, while being superficial and intuitive, was not theoretical. The grinding of pigments and preparation of paints was one of the most labor-intensive aspects of the painter's workshop. Every workshop had servants whose sole job was to grind pigments and prepare paint, as seen in the engraving by Johannes Stradinus of 1600. The close association between painters and pigments provided an empirical understanding of materials. By the late 18th century, that situation had changed due to the availability of commercially produced pigments and paints. William Williams, in his essay on the mechanics of oil colors, refers to the situation by admonishing artists to make himself well acquainted with the qualities and hues of the different pigments in their dry state, that he may judge of the goodness or deficiency of them when ground in oil. It is a pity, but it is true, there are many, and some of much merit, that scarce know the difference of umber and ochre in their crude state, seldom if ever seen them but in bladders. Most of the innovations in artist materials occurred first in England. In English publications of the 17th century, the first references to bladder colors are found. By the 18th century, this method of storing paint was quite common, and numerous colormen advertised bladder colors on their trade cards without the need for further explanation. Of course, even from relatively early times, the basic pigments were obtained from colormen. The making of pigments into paint was the sole responsibility of the artist's workshop until the 17th century. Only the large-scale production of colors could sustain any degree of mechanization. In 1785, John Morgan announced in the Independent Journal of New York that he had erected a mill for the sole purpose of grinding colors. Windmills and watermills became the source of motive power for the making of colors. A horse-powered mill is illustrated in the trade label of Joseph Emerton, whose son-in-law continued the business from about 1744 to 1753. It is a mill of this kind that J.M.W. Turner recorded in his painting An Artist Colorman's Workshop of 1807. As seen in the background, horse and donkey mills were used for grinding large quantities of cheap pigments such as ochres, siennas, and umbers used by decorators and artists. In this picture, we can see the colorman himself grinding red pigment into oil using a heavy muller. The loss of direct experience with pigments and their interaction with binding medium, and the aspiration of artists to the intellectual and social distinction established by the academies may explain why artists in the 18th century began searching for secrets that would allow them to achieve the glorious colors of the old masters. The search for secrets actually developed into an obsession with many painters working in England toward the end of the 18th century. These artists believed that the genius of Titian and the Venetian school were attributed to the use of a secret medium. The obsession even led to a scandal for Benjamin West, then president of the Royal Academy of Arts in London. West, along with several of his colleagues, thought the supposed secrets used by Titian and other 16th century Venetian masters were revealed to them. An artist named Anne Provis and her father Thomas Provis approached West with what they claimed to be a copy of an old manuscript that explained how the Venetians worked. For 10 guineas, one could get a personal demonstration of the techniques described in the manuscript from Anne Provis. Artists of the era believed the old master's secrets of painting were lost. And in his eagerness to learn the methods of the Venetian painters, West began using the practices described in the manuscript in his own work. The problem was, the manuscript was a fake. When they finally exposed the fraud, the embarrassment was far worse for West than for the other victims. West was ridiculed in song, in the press, and in a satirical engraving titled Titianus Redivivus by James Gilray. The whole episode demonstrates the confusion that arose between the practice and theory of art, a confusion for those painters who were trained in the traditions of the workshop and who now aspired to the social distinction which the Royal Academy institutionalized, and that Joshua Reynolds' discourses provided a manifesto. Reynolds stands as the archetype of artist in the latter half of the 18th century. Although one of the greatest artists of his time, many of his paintings suffered defects in comparison to earlier works due to the absence, in his case, of the artistic tradition on which the others leaned. English painters in his early days possessed a sound technique, and many of their best pictures are well preserved. Reynolds was not content with the methods of his teacher Thomas Hudson. In his desire to achieve the effect which he found realized in the works of the Venetians, he embarked on all sorts of unsound experiments in pigments and media. The painter Benjamin Haydon referred to Reynolds' use of wax and oleoresinous mediums, said he wondered that Reynolds' paintings did not crack while still on the easel. The result was the ruin of many of his works and the commencement of an era of uncertainty in methods that seriously compromised the efforts of many artists following him. He accounts for his uncertainty partly from his want of training and partly from his inordinate desire to possess every kind of excellence that he saw in the works of others. Common to many of his experiments was an oil painting medium called McGilp. In fact, one of the earliest mentions of this medium is found in Reynolds' notebook of 1767. This medium consisted of mastic gum dissolved in turpentine mixed with black oil, composed of linseed or walnut oil cooked with litharge or white lead. Earlier recipes often omit the mastic and substitute wax. The obscure origin of the word McGilp is reflected in the many variations of its spelling. By 1854, a total of 23 different versions were listed in Fairholt's Dictionary of Terms in Art. McGilp makes oil paint thin, glossy, and easy to work with a short drying time. When added to oil colors, it creates glazes that help produce a sensation of depth by producing transparent colors that hold in place rather than running or sagging. Reynolds used various formulations and proportions of McGilp in his work, which has led to variations of yellowing and solubility in his paintings, and made them very sensitive to cleaning. An example of Reynolds' use of McGilp is the portrait of Lord Heathfield of Gibraltar. Examination of paint cross-sections allows conservators to relate the physical effects visible on the paint surface to the materials chosen by Reynolds and his particular painting methods. The portrait of Lord Heathfield, so much admired in its day, has unfortunately suffered from the irreversible effects of Reynolds' painting techniques. A treatise on the art of painting published in London in 1797, only 10 years after Reynolds painted the picture, cautions against such methods. A report published in 2010 on the condition of the painting today concludes that the painting should not be cleaned and that removing the restorer's varnish could not have been done safely. In addition to McGilp, Reynolds used several other binding media and mixtures, such as in the paintings of Sarah Siddons. Some pictures were painted entirely in wax, while others combined layers of oils interspersed between complex mixtures of resin, waxes, and oil. Reynolds' use of resinous mediums was responsible for the severe cracking in many of his pictures. One of his pupils, James Northcote, wrote about Reynolds' technique in a letter to his brother, dated August 23, 1771. He wrote, "He uses his colors with varnishes of his own because the oils give the colors a dirty yellowness in time. But this method of his has an inconvenience full as bad, which is that his pictures crack, sometimes before he has got them out of his hands." Northcote also remarked that it is common with painters in London to use mastic varnish with their colors. The widespread use of such mediums by artists in the latter half of the 18th century led to the commercial production of a multitude of varnishes, such as copal oil and spirit varnishes, and mediums based on such varnishes as Roberson's mediums, which was a mixture of mastic varnish, copal varnish, and dryers. The use of complicated applications of paint and the combination of oil and resin, such as McGilp, gumption, and copal mediums, which are so characteristic of paintings by artists of the 18th and 19th centuries, such as this one by Turner, appear to be responsible for many of the drying defects in pictures of this period. Rediscovering the secrets of the old masters prompted more experiments with wax and resinous ingredients. Hard and soft natural resins were extensively used and written about in the growing literature on painting techniques. The addition of waxes and resins to paint was widely believed to bring greater transparency, durability, and handling properties than oil alone. Sir Charles Eastlake sought to discover the reasons for the superior durability of early oil paintings, hoping that his research published in his book Materials for a History of Oil Painting would help artists of his day. Like many writers of the 19th century, he primarily focused on resinous mediums as the key to understanding the technique of early oil painters. Eastlake was particularly interested in Van Eyck. As keeper of the National Gallery in London from 1843 until he published the first volume of his book in 1847, he examined the Arnolfini double portrait acquired by the museum in 1842. Based on his examination and study of literature, he concluded that resins were the key to the brilliant colors and fine rendering of details in early oil paintings. Referring to Timothy Sheldrake's experiments published in the Transactions of the Society of Arts in 1801, which relate the attempts by this amateur artist to discover the medium of 16th century Venetian masters, Eastlake theorized that amber and copal was the resin used by Van Eyck. Sheldrake found that paints composed of oil and hard resins were more brilliant and resistant to solvents than pigments ground in oil alone. The drawbacks of these vehicles are the tendencies to flow and to yellow. To counter these disadvantages, artists and writers made many recommendations, such as the sparing use of resinous mediums, adding dryers, and using solvents, such as turpentine and spike oil. Eastlake did make some perceptive observations of Van Eyck's technique. Eastlake stressed the artist's intimate knowledge of his materials, stating that, instead, therefore, supposing that the first oil painters had achieved impossibilities by inventing a permanently colorless varnish, it may be concluded that they had the sagacity to adapt their processes to their materials. Eastlake recognized that the paint's brilliance was produced optically by painting thinly on bright white backgrounds. Yet Eastlake could not give up on the idea of using varnishes in oil paint. He theorized that Van Eyck used resinous mediums in his work, using amber varnish in dark colors and a white varnish in light areas in blue. We know that Van Eyck and his contemporaries used linseed and walnut oil, and sometimes combined oil and tempera on the same panel. Van Eyck's process appears to have been more straightforward. Analysis of his paintings reveal he used both bodied and unmodified linseed oil, and sometimes pine resin, depending on his pigment's drying and optical properties. For the remainder of the 19th century, the use of resins in oil paint dominated the literature on painting techniques. It continued in popularity among artists, as evidenced by the numerous product offerings in artist materials catalogs. Interest in complex mediums continued among artists and authors of painting manuals in the 20th century without missing a beat. Max Dorner, professor at the Academy of Fine Arts in Munich, was particularly influential in the first half of the century when he posited that Van Eyck used an egg emulsion with an oil varnish that he could thin with water. His speculations were based on the methods he and his students used to make copies of the master. When they obtained the effects that they found similar to the originals, Dorner concluded they had stumbled upon the actual material and process used by Van Eyck. Helmut Ruhmann, a consultant restorer for the National Gallery of London, commented on Dorner's methods described in his book, The Materials of the Artist and Their Use in Painting. He observed that copying is not a reliable way to understand technique because one is forced to simulate the properties of paint acquired through age. He noted that much of the work Dorner's students using his method was in poor condition. Jacques Meriget had an enormous influence on artists in the 20th century. Meriget was a painter and conservator at the Louvre before coming to the United States, where he was a professor of the Art Students League in New York and the Maryland Institute of Art. From its original inception in 1932, his complex formulas of the early masters morphed from an emulsion of bodied linseed oil, bone ash, litharge, and resin mixed with gum arabic or hide glue to one of damer and linseed oil whipped with gum arabic to create an emulsion. He formulated other mediums for later masters, consisting of mastic spirit varnish and black oil made with large amounts of litharge. One of the most consulted books of the 20th century is The Artist's Handbook of Materials and Techniques by Ralph Mayer, first published in 1940. Although revised many times since then, the book still propagates the mixed technique by early Netherlandish artists. Mayer criticized Meriget for his black oil and mastic spirit varnish recipe in a review of Meriget's book in the Magazine of Arts. He later wrote in The Painter's Craft, "History teaches us that the wisest course is to adhere to the simple oil paint technique as much as possible, to use oleoresinous painting mediums with restraint, and to avoid complex jelly mediums." In seeming contradiction to his advice, Mayer recommended his own resinous oil painting medium of 1/3 damer varnish, 1/3 turpentine, and 1/3 bodied linseed oil. This medium became widely used by artists in the latter half of the century and continues to enjoy popularity even today. Although conservation research in the 20th century continued to inform us that the binding medium of the masters before the 18th century mainly consisted of linseed and walnut oil used in simple techniques, the number of painting manuals and treatises on historical painting techniques claiming to have discovered the lost secrets of the old masters just simply didn't let up. As recent as 2004, American Artist magazine proclaimed, "Now Donald C. Fells, Jr. has produced evidence of the secrets of the Flemish masters." This book is the culmination of 11 years of research with Frank Mason in rediscovering the mediums and methods of painting which, due to the deaths of Van Dyck and Rubens and the demise of the great studio systems, became lost by the year 1700. Not only did 19th century artists, materials manufacturers such as Reeves and Sons, Winsor and Newton, and Roberson produce oil painting mediums to satisfy the hunger for the lost mediums of the old masters, they also innovated upon these mediums with variations based on the developments in science. Developments in the 20th century coatings industry enabled artist materials manufacturers to introduce new binding mediums for oil painters. Besides the traditional drying oils of linseed, poppy seed, and walnut oil, other drying and semi-drying oils are employed in modern oil paints, sometimes as cheap substitutes for traditional drying oils. The use of these oils has not been without issues, causing defects never before seen in paintings of the previous centuries. Although dried, semi-drying oils applied in thick layers have been observed to weep on modern oil paintings. Here, an experiment with a cadmium hue in a mixture of sunflower, safflower oil weeps only 5 years after the paint is dried. Among the changes to modern oil paints have been the use of dispersing agents and stabilizers. The first to be used in contemporary oil formulations were aluminum stearate. This metal soap was first introduced in artist paints in the early 20th century. Since that time, other agents have been used in modern oil paints, such as magnesium stearate, zinc stearate, and castor wax. The addition of stabilizers keeps the pigments in suspension, prevents oil and pigment separation, prolongs shelf life, and provides uniform handling properties of the paints in tubes. Although these additions to oil paints perform these functions well, they also reduce the cost of oil paint production since lower amounts of pigments are needed. In modern manufacturing processes, many other additives have been included in oil formulations. Resins, fillers, surfactants, and other adulterants in different amounts are common, especially for less expensive paints. Unfortunately, industrial secrets do not permit one to know about the addition of these materials, and labels on paint tubes are vague. A phenomenon observed on modern paints, not observed in paintings before the 20th century, is a milky haze on the surface of the paint film. After aging, this superficial efflorescences are observed in modern paint films, particularly those with greater amounts of additives. These efflorescences are likely the effect of the migration to the surface of additives such as stearates and waxes. Paintings produced in the last 60 to 80 years generally suffer deterioration phenomena never or rarely observed in traditional oil paintings. In particular, 20th century oil paintings have conservation problems related to the paint layer's fragility and sensitivity. The binding media and techniques employed by artists working in the 18th and 19th centuries represent a dramatic change, likely explained by the new social status of artists and the decline in the workshop tradition, creating the demand satisfied by industrialization and commercialization of artist materials. The loss of workshop tradition created uncertainty in materials and techniques, so that an obsession developed to find the lost secrets of past masters. The obsession deepened the rift between the theory and practice of painting from the 18th century to the present day, causing the early failure of many paintings of this period. I hope you enjoyed that presentation. That was one of the most interesting topics that I had done research for. This was actually based on a lecture that I gave some years ago. Originally, it was supposed to be delivered at the College Art Association, and then I later gave it at a version of this at TRAC some years ago. One of the things that was most interesting about this is it showed how the inertia of very popular ideas kept people moving forward in a certain path. And even though during this time they were thinking about, as we pointed out, in particular about Charles Eastlake and other individuals who were caught up in this idea of the use of resinous mediums as what was the method or practice that some of the old masters used to enable them to paint in the way they did. This inertia of this popular idea that started really in the 18th century and probably earlier than that, but got its momentum in the 18th century until the fact that the practice and the theory of painting completely separated. And so they no longer could understand how that actual practice, the materials and the use of these materials in their painting could help them achieve or it wasn't necessary to achieve certain effects at all. And even Eastlake admitted that it was actually the technique, their skills and the ability, the craftsmanship, work-like craftsmanship that these individuals had that enabled them to do these, and not these resinous mediums. But he still held on to these ideas, and it continued on and on and on into the 21st century, as we pointed out. Individuals who some of the research, of course, they did was excellent, such as the Demurn manuscript. But we have to understand that there is, when we look at one piece of information, such as the Demurn manuscript, and then try to attribute all of that data to an entire century or several centuries of artists working throughout Europe, we can't. It's very hard to do that, and especially since we understand that Demurn was a doctor and was friends to some of these artists, but was making notes as an amateur would, just like in Richard Simmons' notebooks, which a lot of people haven't had the chance to really examine, and I've had the benefit of looking at some of these works and closely. And definitely there was these ideas of using resinous mediums, but it was clearly misunderstood by many, many artists. And even today, there's a lot of misunderstanding of how to use or the use of resinous mediums and how these were used to achieve some of the effects that we see in old master paintings. One of the most, and by the way, if anybody has questions, please type them into the chat there, and I'll take a look at them and see if I can answer them while I'm still online. I'll keep talking for a little bit. And I wanted to also explain some really important information, and that is when we look at the 20th century and these ideas such as Jacques Meriget and Ralph Mayer proposing different mediums as good to use in their work. In particular, Jacques Meriget went through, and if you read some of his original writings with Curry and Reginald Marsh, they went through these iterations. So in terms of what the mediums were like, very popular at the beginning of the 20th century was this idea of emulsions, and emulsions that were often used or often contained resinous mediums, such as dammer or perhaps mastic in some form. And this is in particular, Max Dorner was a big proponent of it. There's actually a lot of other books that talk about this particular technique. Some of it's also called a mischt technique or mixed technique, which gained some popularity at the end of the 19th century and went into full force in the 20th century. So it's rather difficult to understand how people were so involved in all of these different types of techniques trying to achieve these effects that they see in the old master paintings. What was most important, though, what Helmut Ruhmann said, and that is, when you're copying an old masterpiece, you're actually copying a piece that has acquired different properties through aging. We're looking at pieces that are hundreds of years old, and they have changed. And we take a look at them and we think, oh, the pictures look exactly the way they were 500 years ago. Well, that cannot be the case. And in fact, there has been restoration, there has been lots of hands on these pieces and that have modified them. Now, granted, a lot of the old masterpieces have come to us in very good condition. And so what we're seeing, of course, is something very close to what was originally painted, but we can't say that was precisely the way. So there's a lot of there's what we observe in the paint films, and we're trying to imitate what we're observing now. It's very hard to make that match, and I thought that was a very important observation by this Helmut Ruhmann, who is a conservator, a German conservator practicing in London and Berlin. And he has a book, which is of course dated. It's about cleaning paintings, but it's very interesting. Some of the questions that we have there is, for instance, Joseph asks, is there good materials and practices guide for oil painting that we'd recommend? Unfortunately, no. I really can't at this point in time recommend anything. Because there really isn't something that addresses everything you know quite together in terms of Ralph Mayer has good information. There's some good information in his books. I'm not discrediting the information that was there. I was reading it when I was a young painter, and of course that book was given to me, and I believed in the contents and the veracity of it. I also read Joseph, now I forget his name, who wrote about painting like the old masters, and so it was I believed in what they were talking about. Of course, he was using a Meriget type medium, which is actually just a reincarnation of McGilp. And of course, I know a lot of the Meriget proponents will protest that because they want to make a distinction between McGilp's and Meriget. But when you look at the overall, it's basically the same thing. Now, one of the biggest things that they talk about and how they distinguish Meriget from McGilp is they claim that McGilp's were made with mastic varnish and a black oil that was made with lead acetate, or what they call sugar of lead. But that isn't actually the case, because if you read the recipes of McGilp, and there were, of course, recipes involving sugar of lead or lead acetate, and making the black oil, but we see most of those in the 19th century as opposed to the 18th century. And what's interesting is that they did use different types of lead. They used lead white, they used litharge, or what was known as massicot at the time in the 18th, 17th, 18th centuries to make this black oil. So that is part of what the Meriget recipe. The difference is the Meriget recipe actually has a lot more litharge if you look at it in the making of black oil, which doesn't make a lot of sense if you understand the chemistry of making black oil, which I have and have on numerous occasions. In fact, we still make it as a production item at Natural Pigments because of our interest in some of these historical mediums that still have some interesting value for painters today, if of course used very sparingly. Let me see if I can get another question here. I'm going to add this question here. So it boils down to maybe use of a bit of dammer, but otherwise to stick to just oil mediums. Actually, what I have been recommending is to avoid any resinous mediums like dammer, mastic, and so forth in your oil painting. And the simple reason, and there's a whole article that I wrote on this on the Natural Pigments website, why you want to avoid things like dammer and mastic, such as the Meriget and the McGilp's in your painting, is because of the fact that even if you get over the fact of the yellowing and the potential cracking that resinous mediums do tend to cause, the main problem with these is the fact that they change the solubility of the oil paint film. So oil paint films are quite resistant to most solvents, but that you can't say that for these resinous mediums. So when it comes time to clean them or to remove a varnish that's on your oil paint, they're going to have to use a solvent. And when they use the solvent, of course, and of course nowadays there's cleaning methods that try to avoid the solvent penetrating into the paint film, but nevertheless the solvent will penetrate the paint film, and there it causes swelling and damage to the either dammer or mastic or whatever resin may be there. So whereas that's not quite the same effect that it has on oil paint itself. So that's why we don't recommend using any kind of resinous medium. Now, using it sparingly, for instance, for a particular effect, as did the old masters, that's probably an okay method. And I'm not going to say to stop using anything overall. That's a choice that you have to make. But now the best thing is that you now have the information to make those choices in an informed way, and that's really the key that we're trying to teach here with artists. Some of the other questions, let me see. This is a good question by Arun. Were there any scientific testing done on Meriget medium? I'm not sure what you mean by that in scientific medium testing on the Meriget medium. There's a lot of opinions out there. Some say the medium itself is bad, and some say the amount of ingredients are more important. Yeah, there's all of those discussions, but again, the key part of it is the mastic itself. Now, again, in this article on the Natural Pigments website, should you use Damer and Merger or Mastics in your painting, the key point there is that these resins have a much different solubility as well as drying rate than do vegetable drying oils like linseed oil and walnut oil and so forth. So, and by the way, in the article, I also noted that many times where we see cracking in old master paintings, it's in the area where there are resins. So, and this may be due to a number of factors. So there hasn't been lots and lots of testing done, but there's been lots and lots of observations about these mediums, the McGilps, the Mergers, and so forth, which are really all the same, just different amounts of ingredients. But the key thing, again, is the mastic resin. That's really the key part of this to understand, because it does change the solubility of the oil paint film. Catherine has a good question. Do conservators today work to prepare future ones about this knowledge? We have to keep in mind that conservators and the budgets that they have for museums are about old paintings. Okay, and that's an important aspect to understand, because you see, they have a need to study paintings that are in the museums at this point in time. And the reason why they're studying these paintings is to intervene in perhaps advanced degradation that they may see in a painting. So for instance, they see some cracking, or they see delamination of a paint film, or they may see other types of problems, a split in a panel, or other, for instance, they may see lead soaps or other types of metallic soaps forming incrustations on the surface of the painting, or they see discoloration. All of these things they study in order to intervene in what is going on, in order to prevent further degradation, to maintain the picture as close as possible to what the original artist intended. So not to alter the picture, because unfortunately that was done in previous centuries, where they actually went in and did some manipulation of the paint, and of course they in essence changed some of the paintings. And Tanya and I have had the absolute privilege to see some of this, where we saw at El Greco at the Dallas Museum of Art, where that had been it was an El Greco in a private collection that had an arm painted over by a later artist, so, or perhaps a conservator. So the problem really is that they're studying what's in the collections today, and that's part of the problem for modern artists, because modern artists are using materials that we have no data about. For instance, a good example of this is in the supports that artists have chosen to use. Artists are using, for instance, MDF panels. Well, we know very little about MDF, and unfortunately, there's such a wide variety and types of manufacture of MDF panels, or any kind of fiber boards that are being used and used in huge amounts across the world, because there are art materials manufacturing companies who are using these as a support, and they're selling that to artists, and artists are painting on them. And without without truly understanding how the MDF is going to perform over the years coming, because MDF is not made specifically as a support for art. It's made for many other functions, such as in furniture, as in architecture and so forth. So that application by the industry is very specific, and they don't design things so that they last forever. And so that's a key thing to understand. So unfortunately, no one's studying that at this point in time, until, of course, we have MDFs in, or lots of these types of things in museums, and then they'll start studying. Right now, for instance, there's a lot of works that are now on plastic, and they've begun to study plastic, and they've started a database of many different types of plastic to understand the degradation of this material. So this is another area that will be coming up in the future, and that's why we urge caution in using or adopting certain materials that we know very little about and how they perform over time. So that's a very important thing to understand. Let me see, there was another question.
Hasse Alan.
Let me see, did I miss that one?
Hasse Alan Medina.
Oh, okay, got it. Jose, did the old masters use resins varnish for something in particular, or were they actually discovered in the 18th, 19th century and just wrongly thought to be used before? The answer to that question is the old masters were using certain resins, and what's interesting, what we do find is they used pine resins or certain types of resins from species of pine trees. And pine resins have been identified in the Flemish masters, but the use was very sparingly, and it was used for a very particular reason. One of the reasons we believe it's been used, of course, was to change the transparency and the drying time of paint films. And so that's a very important thing to consider. Artists today are simply just slathering the entire painting with a particular material without understanding the function that it serves. As an example, pine resins or other types of resins, such as damer and mastic, has a higher refractive index than linseed oil or walnut oil. And as a result, it does increase the transparency of the paint. And that's exactly what we see. And that's why we believe that the old masters used it for that purpose. They would use it in a glaze where they needed to increase the transparency of a particular pigment. So that has a very specific function. And that's what we see in the old master paintings that differs from today, in that they understood what the materials did and they used them for a very particular purpose, such as using bodied linseed oil or some kind of bodied oil, which is what we call today a stand oil. They use that bodied oil to increase the flow and leveling. Also to also change some of the overall properties of the paint that they were working with. So they understood these things. Artists have unfortunately lack that understanding and that education. It's no fault of artists today, by the way. This is part of the educational system that artists had, the training that you had, which lacked that exposure, because today most of art has deemed that as unsuitable for the creative expression of painters today. Certainly that wasn't deemed part of that back then, but that's the whole point of this presentation, is to show how artist status changed from a craftsperson to this elevated celebrity type individual, so that the use of materials became secondary, and how to use these materials. And certainly the labor of making these materials wasn't deemed to be interesting or suitable for the new status of the artist.
Which leads to next question to Christine Lewis.
So, Christine, a teacher told me that it was necessary to use resin in the medium because the oil over the decades will crumble without this product. It's actually the reverse. So, of course, nothing is permanent in this universe. That's the part of the second law of thermodynamics. We're going through increased entropy. So we can't expect anything we do to last forever. But we can hope that they will last longer periods of time. And for that reason, we have things in a museum to actually look at. Excuse me just a moment. Which is a wonderful thing. And we have the ability to see these things in our museums because we had people that were concerned about their craft, and they carefully crafted with a deep understanding of the materials that they were using, and intimate knowledge. And again, it wasn't a scientific knowledge, but it was a knowledge based on direct experience in using these materials, and in the way that artists were taught in the workshop. So they were taught in a workshop, in a work environment, so they understood that they had to use materials in a way that actually worked in order to satisfy the demand of their customers. So that was a very important thing. So does oil paint eventually crumble? Of course it does. It becomes brittle over time. It's changing its chemistry, and on this topic I'm going to be talking tomorrow in how lead white is critical in actually preserving the lifespan of oil paint, and which is not true for any other pigment that is used in oil paint today, which is maybe unfortunate, but it's the way things are. So in actuality, the resins become brittle much faster than oil paint, and will actually lead to more cracking, yellowing faster than oil paint does itself. So unfortunately your teacher has this reverse, but again, not the fault of many of our teachers, and because they were never trained in this, and that's part of the problem that this particular presentation reviews. Well, here's a comment from Elizabeth. I'd heard mention a small amount of pine resin in Van Eyck's work. Interested in its function. Is there documentation of its use, or its presence simply detected by conservators? There has been some information about the use of these materials. In terms of, we do read in some of the treatises about the use of resins in painting, but it was always used sparingly. And again, that's the key. Use these things sparingly. Now, I'm not going to recommend that everybody go out and start using pine resin, because pine resin really isn't a great resin to use, and especially since it does rapidly oxidize and yellow. And there we have more modern forms of pine resin that actually are much better, hydrogenated pine resins and so forth, that are in commerce, that have better attributes than the pine resin that they were using. But nevertheless, again, it was the way they handled it that was key, and that minimized any kind of potential damage that these materials had. And again, I have to stress that it's because they had an intimate knowledge of their materials, how they were used, and used them wisely, which is the point that Charles Eastlake said, that they had the wisdom to modify their processes to the materials. And that's another key point. You see, artists expect the materials to be able to do anything. And that's just not the way the universe works. How many calls we get, people wanting to, for instance, create an oil paint that flows, that you could just spray, or that you could drip like they see with acrylics. It doesn't work that way. And so and unfortunately, no one tells us that. So that's part of the problem. We have to understand that there's limitations to our materials. They can't do everything. There's limitations to us. So why would we not expect our materials to have the same limitations? It's kind of doesn't make sense to me, but that's the way people think, unfortunately. And again, because of the lack of education in our systems, our educational system, our institutions, they don't teach us these. And so it really puts us at a grave handicap as visual artists. And so we're hoping to change this, of course, today. So in terms of using resins, again, use them sparingly, such as Damer or mastic. Use them quite sparingly if you need them. If you don't need them, don't use them. What about this one? Ben? Okay. Great presentation. What is the historical purpose or use of litharge? Any ideas on where Meriger got the idea to use litharge in his medium? So thank you for that compliment. And there is lots and lots of historical information on litharge. Litharge has been in use for many, many centuries, primarily in the making of what is known as black oil, where you cook litharge, which is lead monoxide. It's a kind of a yellowish to orange powder. You cook it in oil at a certain temperature and for a certain duration, and it turns the oil black as coffee. And what it actually is doing is it's forming lead soaps, and this has some drying properties. It's not a fast dryer, so let's make that clearly known. In fact, in some cases, some of the research shows that it actually slowed down drying. And I point that out in our Painting Best Practices webinar. However, it has some interesting properties, primarily from the lead soaps. And some of the research shows that it's quite interesting in its effect. And at Natural Pigments, we do make it. We make it with the minimum amount of litharge in order to give the same effect without loading it with tons of litharge. Now, where did Mériget get the idea? Well, it was already there in history. You could read about it in the treatises. There's actually a treatise by Ruffol, who a French painter, and he has a huge manual, and he talks about this the use of this particular medium, and that's in I believe it was either 1799 or 1801 when that book came out in French, and then there's an English version. You can actually find it on Google Books. And what's interesting is during his travels, or some travels, that they noted that that there was, in particular, that the artists in Italy were using this black oil, and they made a jelly out of it, and so it was actually in use for quite some time. Mériget just simply adopted it and proclaimed it his particular secret. But if you read back in the history of Mériget, you could see that he wasn't sure about this. So he went through many iterations of different mediums until he settled on a particular medium, which is kind of interesting because if you make a discovery, it usually don't go through iterations of the discovery. So, so that's a very interesting point that he came out with. Going on to another. Hi, Ku.
Cool.
Good to have you here. One of the solutions, one solution to some of the issues raised is for more painters to use egg tempera, which is, you must make, that's a brilliant suggestion. We love egg tempera. We love egg tempera artists. They're involved in making their paint and understanding. And Ku, you've done a fantastic job in helping artists. And I hope everybody goes out and gets Ku's book on egg tempera. She's well researched it. Ku and I have been friends for a number of decades now, and we communicate constantly about all of the developments and what we understand about egg tempera. We hope more people enjoy that particular medium. It's a wonderful medium. And as we noted, that the early Flemish painters often combined egg tempera or some kind of tempera with their oil paints. And apparently Van Eyck, however, used that very sparingly, so unlike some of his other contemporaries. Linda, hi Linda. Is it too early to see if Pollock, Mondrian, Kandinsky paintings are having problems with their paintings now? Is the paint flaking off? It's not too early, and in fact, it wasn't too early some decades ago. Those paintings, in particular, of course, Pollock, because he used house paint. And some of his paintings are literally coming off the canvases in which he painted on. So yes, there's lots and lots of problems with modern day paintings. That's not to denigrate the efforts of these artists. Some of these are very good artists who did very interesting works. But the fact is that they did use materials, bad materials in some cases, and materials in the wrong way. So there's lots. All you have to do is search the literature. You'll find lots and lots of examples, which is what I mentioned in this presentation on how the use of materials, not necessarily modern materials, because modern materials are actually very good in some cases. Some cases, as we pointed out, they were used incorrectly by some of the artist materials manufacturers, which is an unfortunate case. For whatever reason, they did that. But it does happen, as it does for any kind of industry. Another from Marcia. So ultimately, the less one modifies paint with anything other than linseed oil based dilutants, the better. Oleogel is just fumed silica linseed oil. That's basically correct. So yes, the less, and again, even Mayer said this. Charles Eastlake said this. They said if you just keep the painting technique to simple oil, you're going to have much more success in the long run. And by trying to figure out how to achieve all of the different effects you want to achieve with just simple oil techniques is absolutely the best. So just keep that in mind. And what I usually try to tell artists is, do everything possible with just oil first. A lot of artists haven't explored that. A lot of artists haven't never used bodied linseed oil in their work, and so don't understand how that can be utilized and how it can do certain effects like leveling and flow out, and they immediately start gravitating towards different mediums, mostly because your teacher told you to do so, and of course their teacher told them to do so, and so forth. So it's this kind of misinformation gets carried on seemingly from generation to generation. Let me see here. We'll go on to, this is a good question from Philip. Can one rely on the archival longevity of an egg tempera oil vehicle such as used by Antigone? Sometimes yes. However, some Antigone was using a mixed technique in many cases, which involved an emulsion that was prepared with a resinous mediums. So therein lies part of the problem. And as I noted, this was very popular in the first part of the 20th century. Dorner was working on this with the students, and as Helmut Ruhmann noted, the condition of his paintings and those of his students are not in good condition even back then when he wrote about that, which I believe was in the 50s or 60s, 1950s and 60s. So you have to, you have to look at those things. And I love the work of some of these artists, Antigone, and some of those artists that are using the Misch technique. Beautiful, absolute beautiful work. And I worry about that technique, especially when it involves the use of any kind of resinous mediums in an emulsion. Not that emulsions necessarily are wrong. They can be problematic, and that's the subject of another discussion on another day because it's very big. Marcia says, would you say that the best supports would be copper or ACM panels? I would say that those are some of the better supports available today. I always hesitate to give an unqualified opinion. We haven't done research on how these supports will last, but the fact is one of the most important aspects of ACM, and by the way, Artifacts in conjunction with Natural Pigments has been doing research on the effects of MDF, plywood, and other types of supports in conjunction with ACM and copper to better understand what's going on. So we've got a test lab set up, and we've got I don't know if it's close to maybe 100 samples of different supports going through different levels of humidity, and later we're going to expose it to different amounts of light to better understand what these supports are doing. But I can tell you right now that the ACM supports do perform quite well, and the key part of it is that they don't expand and contract with changes in relative humidity and temperature, or much in temperature. And that's the key part of a support. All the supports that have been used in history have expanded and contract with changes in humidity and temperature. And humidity changes and causes the greatest amount of change in these kinds of supports, especially stretched canvas. And so when you look at it from that viewpoint, yes, ACM is an ideal support as we know it today. Now, will there be other supports available in the future? Undoubtedly, yes, and we're hoping to have those available. But at this point in time, this is what we have. Now, one thing about copper, I have to mention, copper, of course, is a great support, and we see the historical use of it, so we know how well it can perform. But we have to keep in mind that for oil paintings on copper, if that copper is not maintained in a good environment, it can be the worst possible support that your painting can be on. So it's either it's an either-or situation where it's either going to perform excellently or it's going to perform very poorly. And it really has to do with, and of course that's somewhat true too with all supports, is where these things are kept. If you put them up in an attic or in a basement where there's going to be huge changes in humidity and light and so forth, then you really can't expect much from that. But if you try to maintain it in a controlled environment, then it does quite well. But what's remarkable is that even solid wood panels, from the period of the 15th century, such as those painted on the Flemish painters, although warping, have remained in remarkably good condition for this period of time, and they haven't been in museums through this entire period of time too.
I answered Arun, so you can take Kip.
Okay, and
Kip.
okay, let's go Kip. Thank you. Is the incorporation of resins in areas of paintings to increase transparency just an effort to achieve what varnish after the painting dries does naturally, or is it a different effect? It is a different effect because what you're doing, and as we've learned and you've been a student, of course, in the Painting Best Practice webinar, what we learned there key is that the refractive index of the surrounding medium to that of the pigments, the higher the refractive index is, for instance, from that of oil, then you increase the transparency of that particular paint film, which means that light is going to then be penetrating that paint film more so, and then of course penetrating through the paint film and then becoming either absorbed or reflecting back from the underlying paint films. And the fact is, if the underlying paint film is a bright or lighter color, then you're going to get more light coming back through it. And if you looked at the difference between paint that is applied thickly and paint that is applied very thinly, so that you can see the substrate through the paint film, you can see that the color is quite a bit more saturated in many cases, which is an effect, of course, that is somewhat achieved by using a varnish. Of course, the varnish causes or creates a greater chromacity because it reduces the amount of light scattering going on overall from the surface of the painting. But the effect is quite different from the use of resins in the actual paint film.
Next after that.
Okay. I want to use your red lead and lead tin yellow pigments. How do I prevent darkening if sulfides while working on the painting? Can an intermediary glaze of an oxide pigment help? So first of all, again, you're probably laboring under the impression that there's lots of sulfides in our atmosphere, as it was in 19th century Europe, especially in London. So if you have lots of sulfides in your atmosphere, I would be quite worried because now you have a very high rate of pollution, which used to be the case when coal burning was the principal source of heating and, of course, energy in industrial countries. So yes, it is known that lead colors, lead white, and so forth, often darkened in the presence of hydrogen sulfide air pollution, but that's less of an effect today in modern areas where pollution is being controlled. Lead tin yellow has a fairly good reputation in terms of maintaining its color. Red lead doesn't have as great of a reputation. It can modify. Some cases it becomes lighter because it's going through a modification that changes part of it chemically to a form of lead white. This is still not quite understood thoroughly. And so we do sell red lead, and we sell it for historical interest, and I know a lot of painters like to use it. Not a lot of painters, but some painters like to use it, and it's a very interesting color. But we do recommend that a varnish be applied over these so that it can help prevent some of the alteration of these particular pigments. A varnish would be more important than a glaze of an oxide pigment at this particular point.
So I think Linda had second question and we skipped
it?
Yeah. I like to use spike oil with green earth, your titanium white and burnt umber when you go into underpainting. Is it recommended?
So is spike oil, green earth, and titanium white and burnt umber when doing an underpaint, is that recommended? Spike oil is just another solvent, whether you use turpentine or odorless mineral spirits or mineral spirits. It's up to you entirely. It's up to you in terms of your health and safety. Green earth is a great pigment. Rather than using titanium, of course, we're always recommending to use lead white everywhere possible. And burnt umber. Now, some people have various opinions on burnt umber, but the main problem with burnt umber has been it tends to promote sinking in. But we've also demonstrated that this can be largely offset by using bodied oil. So that's what. So that is a recommended. That could be an approach if you use the lead white, umbers, and green earths in you're doing your imprimatur, your underpainting. Certainly, that can be a good combination. Any other questions here?
Go all the way down to Jose.
Okay, so Jose, got another question for you here. So to substitute the high refraction of resins, could one use a transparent pigment, which would be the best, leaded glass? And that's what we see that was done by many artists in past centuries, particularly the Venetians used a glass, and they used they used either leaded crystal glass or a soda glass in their work in order to achieve that. And that's correct, because lime glass or soda glass has a refractive index very similar to that of oil. It's I believe about 1.5 or 1.51. That of linseed oil and walnut oil is 1.48. So very similar in nature, so you can achieve, and that's exactly what the Venetians did, and many artists. It's been they found glass, and they're actually identifying this more and more in many cases. It's been identified in some of Raphael's paintings, some of the late Italian Renaissance and early Italian Baroque. Seemed to be used more so in Southern Europe, but it's also been found in artists of the Northern Europe. So yes, that's an excellent way to avoid the use of resins, if that's what you want to do.
So last question, Marina, and that's it.
Okay, one more question we have time for. Can your pale oil and other fast drying oils be used for oiling out glazing, or should they only be added to paints on the palette to speed up the drying process? Excuse me. So if you're referring to our pale drying oil, which is basically an oil that's been cooked with a manganese dryer, we recommend using that very sparingly. In fact, I recommend using dryers very sparingly, if at all, in your paintings, because dryers are accelerating the aging process of paints, so that paints, and that's what's been noted by a number of studies. One in particular by Marion Mecklenburg of the Smithsonian has noted that paint films tend to appear as they are older. In other words, they measure the aging of paint films, and as paint films get older, they become more brittle. And apparently, the dryers tend to make these paint films more brittle faster or sooner, which is, in a sense, accelerating the aging process. So if you can avoid the use of dryers, absolutely, we do recommend that. Dryers, it's kind of funny how artists are using slow drying oils and then putting dryers in them to speed things up. It's kind of like putting your foot on the brake pedal and the gas at the same time, which doesn't make a lot of sense. If you want things to dry faster, use less oil, use linseed oil, and overall, you can use solvents sparingly, but we're always trying to help artists to avoid the use of solvents, because that's one area that you almost impossible to prevent exposure to the vapors of solvents. So in your studios, most of your studios aren't equipped to properly, even with ventilation, properly protect yourself from exposure to it. So, but yeah, that's you can use those as dryers rather than using them as medium oils to, for instance, especially in glazes, where and in not necessary to use them in oiling out, certainly. So try to keep those things for what they function as, which is for drying. So it looks like I want to thank you for all of your questions. Stay tuned tomorrow, and we're at the same time, and I'm going to be talking about lead white, and is it available? Is it, because you probably noticed that a lot of manufacturers, it's out of stock, and we'll talk about the reasons why for that. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you tomorrow then. Bye now.